Hello. Today is November the 22nd, 2024. Doing a little follow-up podcast to last week's Friday chat. This week was kind of a big week because Pluto went into Aquarius for the last and final time. And I had some thoughts on Pluto going into Aquarius. I mean, there's been a lot of thoughts and a lot of talk about Pluto and Aquarius, of course. So, what else new do I have to add? Well, I was reminded when Pluto went into Aquarius that Aquarius is not it's not like a soft, cozy, comforting sign. It's not a water sign. Aquarius can be a little harsh in kind of its detached, erratic nature. Of course, the root of Aquarius is this liberation and change. And so, there's just a lot of stories coming in about some kind of sudden and hard changes that some folks have gone through. A bunch of housing crises stories, just things that have come up suddenly and been not easy changes in people's lives. So I was just kind of reminded that Aquarius is it's definitely not a teddy bear. It's not Cancer. Pluto is, it can be hard, it can be a hard energy to work with. What it delivers is not easy. And, like we say, if you're going through a really hard Pluto transit, you may not know for 2 years later or even longer exactly why you had to go through what you went through. You might not even know in this lifetime. But, Aquarius is a sign of hope. The Pluto in Aquarius does have this silver lining that there's some hope of some real change. And I'm going to get more into that. There was a few things I'm going to tie back to last week's podcast. If you listen to that, I felt like I left some things kind of unsaid. So I'm going to add some more details and go through the last two Uranus returns for the USA and a little larger context for Uranus's return to its North Node in Gemini. But also I wanted to start off today just with an acknowledgement that that there's a lot of suffering in the world. There's a lot of joy in the world too. But these are hard times, and I am witnessing in my life a lot of people having hard times, so I want to acknowledge that there's a lot of suffering. And when we ask what the root cause of this suffering is, we can look at the individual level and we can look at the collective level. And relative to this Pluto in Aquarius, I think that there's a lot of social change that is needed for society to get back on track. Maybe it's been off track for some millennia in a lot of parts of the world where it hasn't been supporting individuals and all people equally. So this is the fight and the hope and the dream of Aquarius. What that actually looks like and means for different people is very different, of course. But yeah, just to acknowledge that, and in the face of the suffering that we see, I looked up one of the Buddhist metta prayers And this one reads, "May all be free from sorrow and the causes of sorrow. May all never be separated from the sacred happiness, which is sorrowless. And may all live in equanimity, without too much attachment and too much aversion, and live believing in the equality of all that lives." I found that one to be really beautiful because, you know, there is always ups and downs in life. Obviously, there's always something. And even in the face of great hardship and change, there is the potential for sacred happiness. And it is possible to have a happiness and at the same time bear witness, acknowledge, and feel the sorrow and suffering of the world and not be trying to cut off from it or separate from it. I do think that it's not easy, and I do see individuals who really struggle with this, and the weight of the world is too much. And I hope that they find a way to find some happiness. And so, yeah, Pluto and Aquarius, that kind of like erratic, harsh, boom, like it's, I had told somebody about, Aquarius, it gets this reputation as like the ice queen, and there's just I guess that's just like what do you call it? A phrase for a woman who has that detached Aquarius, just like sudden change with no emotion kind of thing. But it's it can bring that. I think that if you think about everything evolving through polarity, the polarity Leo will bring the warmth, where without that polarity, Aquarius can operate very harsh and cold and detached. That's not the evolutionary intention of the sign. The evolutionary intention is that it incorporates heart, the Leo heart, and the generosity and the warmth. And, I feel like Leo can also be really, the combination of Leo into Aquarius can really bring the caring about humanity into a place of action. Yeah, I did want to go back into some things that I said last week, and I did focus a lot on the U.S., and I do live in the U.S., and I always feel bad for focusing a lot on it, but it is what I know, and it's where I live. And so I do have more to break down about that, and the USA's going through some really, 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 really big transits coming up, and has been going through them. But I did want to say, I think that, globally, the U.S. was fated to play a significant role, not to get, not to get like any kind of unhealthy sense of nationalistic pride or anything, but because the birth of the nation has Uranus conjunct its own north node, I see that the U.S. has been playing a global cultural role in bringing a lot of change that the north node of Uranus in Gemini symbolizes. I will say that one of the realizations I had the past year was that the north nodes do manifest. It's not like this calling that we might manifest the north node of the planet, but we might not at all. It's gonna manifest The question is how. Will it manifest in an unhealthy, quote-unquote, shadow or negative aspect, disharmonious with natural law, or will it manifest in its positive way? And as things go with the nature of existence itself, it's usually a full spectrum, especially, if we're talking about the planet, and what are we at, 8 billion? Is that right? Obviously, you're going to see a full spectrum for individuals and cultures and nations all over the planet. So, having said that, the fact that the U.S. has played a global role in change, I think it is important to look at both sides of the coin. And that, for on some of the change in the modern, like modernization of Western technology and culture and the spread of the Western individualistic, right, Uranus and Aquarius correlate to the individuation process at a cultural level. The United States, in a lot of ways, I believe, even though I lack a lot of global context for this, but I will just come out and say that I do get the sense that the United States culturally has brought forward this individualization process more and more, and that definitely is for better and for worse, because I feel like a lot of, with that Aquarius Uranus, there's been a chopping off of our roots of culture and tradition that correlates to family, culture of origin, and the land and the past, and honoring and acknowledging the past, coming in, basically stealing the land from the indigenous peoples that were here, participating in genocide, and then building this nation with stolen human beings, Africans who are now African American, part of the black population in the U.S. That's a lot of heavy karma for a country to start under. And it was the first Uranus return that the nation really faced the, what we call, the hypocrisy of all of this, where, the fight to end slavery. And we know, when I say that I hope to see true social security, and that means that all beings can feel safe and secure in this world. If you're black, if you're a woman, if you're a person of color, if you're queer, the chance of feeling less safe and secure, and actually literally being less safe and secure in the world, is greatly heightened. We've got a long ways to go, but we did, end slavery in that form of it through the Civil War, and that was, the Civil War actually began on the United States Uranus return. So, but I just want to make one more point on just having Uranus in Gemini. Another thing, a Gemini, and I did do a podcast on what's it called, the USA's Neptune or something. I can't remember. It's basically about Neptune in the chart of the United States, and there's a lot of really good material in there, and it really dives into the chart of the U.S. and because there's a lot of aspects and connections within that, and squares from the Neptune in Virgo, naturally squares to the Mars and Uranus in Gemini. And that, for better, when I say for better and for worse, as an element of change in the world, there's a piece there that I feel like the U.S. has kind of done a lot of this good cop, bad cop kind of thing in the world, where the nation, for lack of better words, postures as this kind of savior to the world and the free world and democracy, meanwhile has, passively or actively or hidden agenda participated in a lot of things that have been extremely harmful and detrimental to a lot of different countries, call it imperialism, colonialization, just, a lot of different things. Obviously, we have the biggest military in the world, and, now we're seeing that I think that the goal of the enemies that the U.S. has, because, like, how are you not going to have enemies by playing dirty, we're not some saint as a nation by any means. And so, yeah, we have enemies, and if you can't externally fight, then you're gonna try to cripple the people in the country from within. That's a huge topic, but I see a lot of ways that is happening. A few ways for sure. But getting back, I do think that the North Node of Uranus does have this call for positive change in the world, and that even though the Civil War was obviously like a lot of lives lost, almost tore the country apart, was, a real fight for emancipation. It was successful, and the nation didn't fall apart. Like I said, it began with the USA's first Uranus return. Now, I think Pluto was in Leo at that time, if I remember correctly. Let me just check my notes here. But the thing that is actually really interesting about the Civil War was 2 days after the Civil War began, which is considered, the beginning is considered April 12th, 1861. I'm using this date. So April 14th, 1861, Neptune goes into Aries. So we're going to start to see in 2025 Neptune and Saturn go into Aries in a sextile to Uranus going into Gemini, and a sextile trine to Pluto in Aquarius. Now, Pluto was not in Aquarius then, and I will say that one of the great turning points of the Civil War is considered the Battle of Shiloh. I believe that's how you say it, in Tennessee. It was the bloodiest, almost 24,000 casualties. And, that's pretty freaking insane for that form of combat in 1862. But what's really fascinating about that was it's this pivotal point that kind of shifted the tide and like set the stage for the North to kind of be in position to do a lot more in the war in the future that people consider that led to the victory of the North. At the time of that Battle of Shiloh, okay, so the heliocentric North Node of Uranus, I know in EEA that Jeffrey Wolf Green taught there's a big focus on, I guess basically geocentric planetary nodes are used in charts. I'm a very strong proponent of always being aware of the exact position of the heliocentric planetary nodes. And I've talked about that here and there. I'm not going to get into that right now, but in this case, when I looked it up, the north node of Uranus was 13 Gemini in 19 minutes, and Uranus was transiting 13 Gemini in 14 minutes. That's literally applying 5 minutes of a degree away from its own north node, heliocentric, at the Battle of Shiloh. The other thing about Gemini as a archetype, and you think of Hermes and you think of the caduceus, is like with Gemini, like sometimes like the banana peel on the ground, right? It's like whoops, I didn't see the banana peel, and then somebody falls, and then that leads to this and that leads to that. The caduceus, is a symbol of flipping things, like somebody sleeping and then it makes them awake, or the living become dead, or the dead become alive, or fortunes, or so there's this concept that the deity Hermes has this, with as symbolized in the caduceus, this potential to kind of flip fate and flip circumstances and events. And with Uranus and the north node of Uranus in Gemini, it can be very unexpected in the ways that things shift or flip. So, thinking about that Battle of Shiloh as a turning point, it's like, it was criticized for the loss of life, and the North lost more than the South, and but in hindsight, it's like talked about as pivotal turning point, and like in a sense, there's kind of like this surprise, sudden shift because of it. So like with the Uranus North Node in Gemini, I think in the modern era, you can't really predict Uranus in the first place. And we can look back at the past and see these kind of things and know that there is a spirit of revolution with Uranus and transiting its own North Node in Gemini. If you think about concerns about limiting people's freedom of speech with like technology and the plutocracy and globalization of economy and all this, the North Node of Uranus in Gemini is like, hell no, that's all about, freedom of speech. I mean, like, having the U.S. born with Uranus conjunct its own North Node, obviously, like, freedom of speech is a huge thing in this country, and in a lot of countries, people can't get away with being so open and free. Granted, there are consequences, and depending on how much power and sway certain individuals have and what they say or expose, people have been and disappeared, if they're too big of a threat. So we know that kind of stuff's been happening for a long time, of course. But, it's interesting to think about freedom of speech coming up in this next chapter, especially with Uranus going into Gemini, and seeing how that plays out. I do, at least in the United States, I believe that, even though we seem so divided, there is a very, very, very strong value on our freedoms, and whether that's the right to bear arms or the right to the freedom of speech, people love those freedoms, and for the most part, we all agree on that. So, yeah, so it'll be very interesting. So, yeah, the Civil War began, like I said, Neptune going into Aries, and the first Uranus return started the Civil War. And then Uranus conjunct its own north node was Battle of Shiloh, this very key turning point in the war. And I do, like I really focus on the future, that Uranus's transit to its own north node is going to be huge. I talked about 2028 in the last podcast. I'm bringing it up again because it's going to be, it's huge. 2028, Uranus is going to be transiting its north node, and in the spring, Venus, like usually Sun and Mars are typically like considered your triggers for bigger transits, right? Activations. And I'm not trying to disagree with that, but like in 2020, we had we had Saturn and Pluto on their own south nodes in Capricorn. Two heavyweights conjunct their own planetary south nodes in Capricorn. And, that set the stage for the start of a lot of powerful evolutionary forces in society and economics, and just like the whole structure of reality as we knew it kind of went through this tumultuous Plutonian process, triggered by, of course, the pandemic, but revealing the fragility of the supply chain, and kind of setting us on this spiral of realizing, that in other countries this isn't, new. And that's the thing, is like I think like thinking about suffering and privilege in a lot of places in this country, as well as all over the world, forms of suffering and things that people are facing are nothing new. And so when we get into, I'm jumping around a little bit, I'm going to jump back to I'm going to get into the second Uranus return for the US, but I do want to say that there's this principle in evolutionary astrology, which I consider just a universal principle, a natural law. And that is that when you look at an individual and their evolution, and you think about the magnitude of the cataclysm that Pluto brings into the individual's life, it is considered relative to the evolutionary necessity of how big that needs to be to catalyze the evolution and change that the soul needs at that point in time. The ego self doesn't like it. It's completely insecure. It creates insecurity. It's like, what the F's going on? Extremely uncomfortable. There's nothing comfortable about it. But when we apply this same principle to evolution of cultures, nations, humanity, we're looking at a situation now where there are structures of power in place that perpetuate social systems that benefit few and perpetuate suffering for many, and are often at the expense of not just human life, but all life and the health of the ecosystems in the planet. We want fresh air, we want fresh water, we want food that has nutrients that are good for our body. We want a sustainable way of being in relationship with the planet and our ecosystem locally and regionally. I would like to think that more and more people are realizing that these are things that we all really do need. But can we come to some majority collective agreement about how to steer the greater ship of humanity towards these things, of a nation towards these things? Can we do that? And if we're not doing that, if we're in a crisis and we're failing in a variety of ways, and there's small successes, but in other ways, we're not there. The collective crises, the magnitude of the collective crises necessary to create the unity and the change that, say, like these planetary alignments coming up call for, right, is how great is it needed? How big of a crisis do we have to face before we acknowledge some of these things? With climate change, of course, there's a lot of people who just think it's, well, the climate's always been changing. This is nothing new. It's not getting more dramatic. It's not getting more extreme. Yada, yada, yada. We've gone through great extremes in climate in the past. So, like, is it really changing? Is it? And I guess, like, the thought that we don't have any impact, let's say it is changing naturally in its own natural cycle, but I think that whole argument is a little, like, shallow, I guess, and short-sighted, because what it does is it takes out the piece of, like, well, if let's just say that the ice caps were going to melt anyway, and that we're in an ice age recession or a warming period on the planet. Like, that's just a natural cycle that we're in. Like, this was expected to happen regardless of but do humans have any impact on the overall equation? Does the amount of carbon monoxide being pumped into the atmosphere, does the amount of fossil fuels being burnt by millions and millions and billions of people have any influence? Is it tipping the scales at all? You know what I'm saying? So it's like zero. Like, the laws of nature imply that for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. The concept of karma is that there is some consequence. So to just go about saying that there's absolutely zero, like, we're not part of the equation at all, is it's it doesn't really make sense now, does it? So, but people who have an agenda can keep spinning the story, and people can start believing it or not taking action or not unifying on it to make change. Until when? Until what level of crises? Do the people in North Carolina, have some of those people changed their perspective on climate change? Or is it like, yep, it was just like a biblical once a year? I know we could go, like, it's last days, like these kind of, like, things are expected in the last days. If you're a Christian, it's just, like a confirmation that the second coming of Jesus is going to come. I mean, I love Jesus, and I was very much a born-again Christian, for a part of my life. Jesus is part of my life. I love Jesus, but I do have different views than that kind of approach. It's so that kind of, not approach, but perspective, outlook, belief on interpreting things, could say. Anyway, a side note. It was a long side note, but oh, jeepers. Well, the second, I was looking up, like, okay, like the second Uranus return for the U.S. was August 1943, May 1944, and February 1945. And now, I was of course thinking like World War II, right? Yes, but the interesting thing is this time World War II ends when Uranus transits its north node and completes this pass, because it's like, it's not just the U.S. Uranus, but we're talking about globally for everybody. It's like when Uranus got up to its north node, it was actually the end of World War II. And in this time, instead of Neptune being in Aries, it had just entered Libra. And now coming up, we're going back to the Neptune Aries thing. So just to insert there, Neptune correlates with collective consciousness. Like what's brewing in the collective consciousness and the collective psyche. When Neptune is in Aries, there's definitely more of a call for action. And perhaps when Neptune goes into Libra, there's more of this collective percolation of peace and creating more harmony and bridge building. And so we're going into this Neptune and Aries. Now, like going back to this, like in the US with the Civil War starting and Neptune going into Aries, I think like the very unfortunate thing about war is the amount of suffering and that happens because of it. And could we create change without having to go through such things like this? Those are big questions. But, thinking about that, at the time of the Civil War, the North wasn't like, oh, poor me, I'm a victim of the South, now I have to fight them. Like there was a spirit of like wanting to fight. And so I think when we think about this social catalyst of Neptune going into Aries again here, and what's going to happen in the collective consciousness is, like thinking about like what is at stake for humanity, what is at stake for the majority of the people, and how will they, in the modern era, fight for what they see at jeopardy. And in a way, this is completely unpredictable. It's completely unpredictable how this might play out because we don't really know what people could rally around. People could rally around something that, in this Gemini, Uranus, like, and today it's like, like North Node of Uranus and Gemini, it's like instant messaging. Like we could have something spread across the entire globe, one event that triggers a huge shift that is just for some reason becomes the one detail that flips things, and then so not to get too out there yet, maybe I already am out there, but yeah, I don't want to dive hardcore into the World War II chapter necessarily, but just for the record here, the third Uranus return for the United States is, like it's the triple pass thing. So like the outer planet like crosses once, it goes retrograde over, and then it crosses again. very common. If you know astrology, you know that you get often a triple pass, sometimes even more with Neptune and Pluto. Or if the planet's also moving by progression, or anyway, not to get complicated here, but I once had, I think my progressed Mercury was going through Aquarius when Neptune was transiting Aquarius, and I had like 17 or 19 conjunctions of Neptune to my progressed Mercury. I literally, by the end of it, thought my brain was like scrambled eggs and that I might like lose my ability to function. My brain. It was kind of getting scary. It's okay though. Just out there, if you're having a Neptune Mercury thing and you got some brain fog, you know, that too hopefully will pass. Get proactive, exercise it, exercise the mind. So let's see, checking my notes here. There was a few other things I wanted to say. Yeah, I mean, back to the Civil War and the U.S. chart, our Mars is at 20 Gemini, so, Uranus was also transiting the Mars of the U.S. in that chart. Uranus transited the north node of Venus, heliocentric. North node of Venus is there in Uranus. And I did look up because 1861 and 1862 would have been this, activation of the north node of Uranus by its own transit. I looked up and, I haven't really done a lot of research on it at all, but 1861 was the unification of Italy and at the same time abolishing serfdom in the Russian Empire. So we see some, I guess all of these things are kind of like in the bigger picture, kind of like wins for humanity. I think that Pluto in Aquarius is kind of like wanting us to have this win for humanity. And last week in the podcast, I was talking about how we saw, really the stage for World War II was set by the era with Pluto in Cancer and the rise of dictators and fascism. And I was pointing out how I thought the Pluto in Cancer era gave this opportunity for power to manipulate insecurity in a way to gain more power. I think in the same way, Pluto in Capricorn, consolidation of power, the plutocracy growing, the greater consolidation of wealth, like in the sense that a healthy Pluto in Capricorn would have really meant some real accountability, social accountability. It was certainly talked about. I think like the number of people, for example, in the United States that are educated on the concepts of, say, reparations, and like thinking about corporations and there's a lot of things that entities that, and even individuals, somehow just like aren't being still held accountable for. So yeah, I actually I guess okay, funny thing is obviously the US just elected Donald Trump for president for his second term, and in Donald Trump's chart he has a sun in Gemini sun, right? Conjunct Uranus, conjunct his north node, all in the 10th house, and that is by the north nodes of Uranus and Venus in Gemini. I would say that this individual soul in this incarnation does have some collective role to play in this north node of Uranus and Gemini drama that's playing out. And it remains to be seen how, honestly. I mean, we can speculate. I think like one of the things that we know that's like pretty obvious with it is things need to go to a certain extreme. I think like in President Trump's case, Donald Trump has Pluto in Leo in the 12th house and Mars in Leo in the 12th. I'm pretty sure that's a new phase. I do see this as very much symbols of a soul that could kind of like really like idealize like playing God. And relative to that, the South Node is in Sagittarius in the 4th, conjunct the Moon in Sagittarius in the 4th. I see the Moon in the 4th house correlate with ego and personality. Sagittarius, of course, correlates to the principle of expansion. And so when you kind of think about that Sag Moon on the South Node of Sag in the 4th, relative to, you know, having the power to quote unquote play God, so to speak, fulfilling this, you know, desire, whether it's how conscious it is or not, or what story that he's telling himself, I definitely see that in the chart, this attraction to power. You know, now he's hanging out with Musk, one of the wealthiest people on the planet, and I just kind of wonder is like how much the 330 million people or whatever we have in the US really believe that the wealthiest people are really out for the greater welfare of all humanity, because their track record doesn't really show it. We need proof. Like, you're really going to care? Is there really going to be trickle down? Like Ronald Reagan said. So playing God, and like literally like 12th house, Pisces, Neptune, you know, like this Mars, Pluto, desire, you know, like it's like desire for power, Leo, like top of the pyramid, you know, like I really think like it's like literally being drunk. Like you're under the influence of drugs, and the drug is the power and the fame. And so like maybe there's not actual like substances in the body, but I think like with impeccability and integrity that we ideally would want to see in a leader, we kind of always have to say like ask the question of how do they handle fame and power, and what does that do to their ego. And you know, in the case of a Moon in Sag conjunct South Node in Sag in the 4th house, that is like the most I've ever seen a symbol in a chart that correlates to ever expanding ego. So the ego is getting bigger and bigger. And for some reason, he's actually like destined to play this role. But there is, you know, this thing, I think, like, you know, so it's like, you know, I'll just say, like, I mean, there's karma. There's only like we can get drunk and think that we have the power and think that we're doing that thing, like we're the ones doing it. I personally have come to the awareness that it's not us doing it, that there is another force in the universe, and if you want to call it God, if you want to call it divine will or spirit or the universe itself or whatever, call it what you will, but there is another like element at play I don't personally believe that it just breaks down. This is like this is my personal opinion on the matter. You know, like I am I able to prove this? I don't know. Probably not. But um, how I see it is that there's this greater drama, and because there has been so much suffering for so long, it's really hard with the horrors that so many individuals have gone through in so many lifetimes for so many centuries. It's really hard to understand suffering, and why it's here, and to even believe that there's some other thing going on. But I do believe that like there's only so far, like everything can only go so far in one direction before something pushes back on it from going in that direction. Like those are laws of nature. So even if we just get down to laws of nature on a social collective level, so yeah, Donald Trump's got the Supreme Court. He's got his all the people that are backing him, and Republicans control the House and the Senate. It's like green light to like do everything that he wants to do to like fulfill this deep soul desire to play God at this crazy level, and have access to this power. But he's fooling himself to think that he has access to that power. Like he does, and he is going to be doing things, but it's not without consequence. And this is all setting the stage for Uranus transiting its north node, trined by Pluto in Aquarius, with Neptune and Aries at the midpoint. Like this is all the catalyst for the change. And so like tables can turn, things can flip in a second, and like you don't see it coming. And I would love that it didn't have to take so much suffering for us to get there. And that's another larger conversation which I've gravitated towards, Swami Shri Yukteswar's holy science and interpretation of the yugas and cycles of consciousness and ignorance on the planet as another lens, in conjunction with the astrological ages, sub-ages, and the Neptune-Pluto conjunctions and the planetary nodes. Those are all the things I use personally to kind of get some larger lens on the whys, but still, does it ever really make sense? But I've got to wrap it up here, folks. And I got a whole bunch I didn't get to today, so maybe I'll try to get back to this in a week or two. But I want to leave you on a little positive note here. And I think, like, I'll say that, again, Aquarius is the sign of hope. And I think, honestly, like, there's been, like, Saturn and Capricorn are heavy. It correlates with depression. I remember was it 2007 or 2008, Jeff Jower, rest in peace, great astrologer who passed on, gave a Pluto and Capricorn talk at the Northwest Astrological Conference. I think it was maybe like, it might have been the Saturday night talk. I don't remember exactly, but he came in, and at the time, I think, at the time Pluto was still in Sag, and he came in with this like doom, gloom, heavy, like it was just like, and I was like, being my optimistic self, being like, yeah, but isn't there going to be this positive spin on it? Well, that was a heavy era. I just want to say, like, Pluto and Cap was heavy. a heavy, heavy, heavy era. And in that heaviness, there has been a lot of collective depression, I believe, a lot of depression. And relative to the Neptune in Pisces, that depression has correlated with people checking out. And I talked about this on the last thing. And so Pluto going into Aquarius is kind of like the awakening, the people waking up. And then Neptune into Aries is the call to action. And so another thing that's depressing is that nobody's doing anything, and you're like watching and noticing the inequality, the injustice, the suffering in the world, and you're like, what's happening? Yes, there's a lot of beautiful things that don't make the news, and a lot of amazing souls out there doing great work all the time. And we need that for inspiration. We need each other to remind ourselves that even if it looks bleak and grim, I had this realization that these things are all still worth talking about. You know, even if we've been talking about recycling and living sustainable for 40 years and it seems like we're going backwards, the conversation and the intention of the spirit, if we're talking about injustice and inequality and the fight for equality and freedom for all and true social security for all, like all these things are just like, you know, like to forget them, to drop the conversation just because it's like, gosh, we're still not there. Oh, well, I give up. You know, giving up is futility, and futility correlates with Capricorn. And so my point being is, like with Pluto and Capricorn and the heaviness, I think that there has been more of this spirit of futility. It's like the powers that be just are like have so much power and wealth, like corporations are people, like we can't fight this level of power or money. Other people, especially when, like like the Occupy movement, it's like we're the 99%. Oh wait, we're the 5%, So there was futility, and then Neptune and Pisces, there was disassociation. And those were unfortunately some very predominant cultural patterns that were at play. Now, that don't get me wrong, there's a lot of other beautiful stuff in there. I don't want to just paint a one-sided picture, but I will say that this is my message of hope to you, is that we got through that period, and buckle up or not, we are heading towards a period of insane change. And within that, there's going to be a spirit of revolution. There's going to be Pluto and Aquarius a waking up. Well, we've already got woke being, like coined as a thing, an insult, perhaps you call it. But, waking up to seeing we've been hoodwinked by a few really rich people, and that the people can take the power back, and that there is a path towards action, and that we can get divided on the same issues, but we can keep in mind the large common ground that we have on a lot of issues, and at some point we can put some of those differences aside to make the real change that we need. So how's this going to all play out, and how much crises will we have? I think the silver lining is, like, there's already been crisis, there's already been suffering, like we know that's going on, but it feels like it's been not leading to change. Like, I guess, like, the silver lining here is that the crisis is leading to a period of rapid change. So I will leave you on that. Until next time, this is Redwood. May you be well. Much love.